Now we're back with Where's the Voice Coming From by Rudy Wiebe. So we've discussed a considerable part of what Wiebe talks about in his story. And as I mentioned, his language and how he chooses to either intellectualize and sort of critique very subtly is one of the most interesting things about his story. In fact, what is personally fascinating is how he kind of uses the Mark Antony technique to point out the flaws of the character. So much like how in Shakespeare's play, Mark Antony in his famous speech seems to be saying good things about Brutus, but is actually pointing out how flawed a person he is. Similarly, here you have statements where Wiebe seems to be praising the white Canadian police officers, but he's actually questioning them. He's actually critiquing them. So, for instance, he calls them out when he says, both are unequivocally labeled and must be assumed that a police force with a worldwide reputation would not label such evidence incorrectly, but here emerges an ultimate problem in making the story. So this is when we come to the main problem of the story. Yes, because everything up till now has not been problematic enough. So, the main problem is the official description of Almighty Voice. Now, he's been given official descriptions on his awards proclamation and so many things because, there's a bounty issued on him. Now, the narrator compares the two descriptions along with the photo that we have of Almighty Voice that he describes. Now, most things he's like, maybe can be explained away, how can we make that judgment just through a photo? Except, he is described in the awards proclamation as having a feminine appearance. But the narrator says that in the photo, the face he saw was like an axe. So clearly an extremely masculine and intimidating face. Not the kind of face that you would call feminine. I don't think any woman wants to be called as someone who has a face like an axe. So not a very feminine description to begin with. Now, the thing is, in colonial representations of colonized spaces, something Edward Said discusses in his book Orientalism, there is a feminizing of the Oriental male and there is an exoticizing of the Oriental female. So the women are either seductresses or to be sidelined, haze in the background. And the men have to be emasculated so that the white colonial can be placed as superior. There are different ways they do it. Alright, like I think in places where the colonized man is physically similar, then you have to sort of critique their intellect, you have to critique their knowledge, their awareness, make them seem foolish, childlike, alright? Or in cases where maybe their physical appearance is very clearly, maybe they're of a shorter stature, then I think it becomes easier. You're like, oh, look at them, effeminate. It's problematic because when you emasculate a people, you are also sort of psychologically undermining them and undermining their ability to fight back, to critique, because you're saying, hey, you don't have power. You can't match up. You're not on the same level as us, so why try? And you can see actually a very interesting response to this in Indian cinema. Mihir Bose, in his book Bollywood: A History, talks about the Punjabi influence on Bollywood and where it emerged from. So, during the colonial era, the European male was placed as the apex example of masculinity, and the Indian man, in comparison, was framed as effeminate. So, to combat the emasculation of the Indian male, filmmakers who wish to challenge the colonial authority in creative expression, especially in visual expression, which is a very powerful medium to work with, they chose to cast men from the northwest frontier who could visually match the European male and thus challenge this emasculation. So you have the idea of the hatta katta Punjabi man, alright, the taller, broader, fairer and having a specifically masculine appearance. Masculine in terms of the fact that the white colonial is presented as the masculine ideal, all right? And so that becomes the popular choice, the tall, masculine, fairer physique of the Northwestern frontier. Not that that still continues, because masculinity is a changing idea in Indian cinema, but during the colonial period, this was really a thing, and we still see offshoots of that even now. But it's a very interesting point. Now, to return, and I return with a quote from Wiebe first. These statements cannot explain the storyteller's activity, since despite the most rigid application of impersonal investigation, the elements of the story have now run me aground. If ever I could, I can no longer pretend to be objective, omnipotent disinterestedness. I am no longer a spectator of what has happened or what may happen. I am become element in what is happening at this very moment. Let's unpack this, because this is the turning point in the entire text, because like I said, we haven't questioned the narrator up to now, right? Because he's so reliable. He's white, he's male, he's intellectual, all of these things, and he seems fair and neutral. But he's inserting himself into the story. And he's even making statements like, if ever I could, I can no longer pretend to be objective. Okay, so very, very loaded kind of a statement that we have. So the thing is that once he inserts himself into the story, he complicates the entire narrative, and that makes the entire story unreliable, which means we now have an unreliable narrator that we cannot trust. So we realize that going forward, nothing can be trusted, and probably everything else we've read up till now cannot be trusted. And that is so interesting, because you suddenly start to see a lot of things fall apart. So there are statements that he records, and it comes at least twice over. Twice over in the story, where he records what the police officers call out to Almighty Voice and to the men in the standoff along with him. They say, "Hey Injun, you'll get hung for stealing that steer. Hey Injun, for killing that government cow, you will get 3 weeks on the wood pile. Hey Injun." So it's like they're just calling it out like repetitively. But these are very contradictory statements, because on one side you're saying he'll be hung, death. On the other hand, you're saying the wood pile, which means most likely pillory, so a punishment. That makes no sense. You can either die or be punished and then die. I mean, there is a problem outright here. And you think it can't get worse, but then we have what Almighty Voice says, which is, "We have fought well, you have died like braves, I have worked hard and I'm hungry, give me food." So you realize that this entire thing, which was sort of presented to us as some kind of malicious act or some kind of, I don't know, violent revolt, which is why there's a standoff, a gun standoff, it's actually about survival. It's something so basic. It's about access to food, and that changes the entire narrative. It becomes a really different kind of a story altogether, because Canadian winters are brutal, right? And it can be sparse in so many places. Most of the fertile grounds would have been occupied by white colonials, which means that the rest, the Cree and many other indigenous communities, may have been pushed to spaces where they might be struggling to eke out a living. How are they to survive when they don't have access to food, right? And actually the premise of the text, because it's an actual historical event that we is sort of using, Almighty Voice killed a steer that he claimed belonged to his grandfather, but the government claims that it belongs to them, and thus he must be punished. So you realize that anything and everything that may have belonged to the indigenous communities have been taken over and claimed as white property, right? It's sort of like something Rob Nixon mentions in Slow Violence when he talks about the Lockean dilemma, which is that the people definitely belong to the land, but the land does not belong to the people. So you might say, hey, we've lived off the land for millennia and millennia and since time immemorial. Doesn't mean you have ownership, which means anything on it doesn't belong to you, because I have like a record saying this belongs to me, meaning you are now a criminal for claiming something that may have for millennia belonged to you. So it changes the whole narrative. It breaks down the entire text. It makes you sort of wonder, what did you walk into? You walked into thinking you were going to get a historical record about a gunfight, about a standoff, about a criminal being caught, and then you realize that this is about survival, this is about access to food, this is about how the indigenous population is further and further pushed away from spaces of access, and how out of bitter survival, what are you going to sort of do? What are the steps you will end up taking to ameliorate your problems, really? So we see the hungry are villainized in the story because they want food, but hey, how dare you want food that belongs to the government? And you're not people because you're not white, right? And if you, yeah, by the way, the story gets worse because the closing paragraph of the entire short story is when the narrator describes Almighty Voice's final statements as an unending, wordless crime. Why? Because he doesn't understand Cree. So he has no clue what they were fighting. He doesn't understand their perspectives. He's unaware of the entire process. So he then becomes like any other white historian who records half-baked history of especially colonial history without getting an idea of the other side of the story. And so that is the most problematic part of the entire thing, because you have not accurately established what the indigenous experience is all about, and you are just recording it and being like, hey, this is it because these are the facts that we have, because we have made a note of it. And that is just an unending wordless cry. It's completely irrelevant. So what we end up doing at the end of the story is that we are questioning the validity of the entire text, because through Wiebe's storytelling, he has unpacked this intellectual doublespeak that permeates a lot of narratives about indigenous communities, about colonized spaces, about land, especially land that has been lived on and stewarded by communities that are functioning from very different lens as compared to, say, your settled communities, all right, because these are nomadic groups that live in close proximation to nature. They have a very different understanding of the land, all right, they're stewards of the space, and their understanding is completely negated in this entire text. And so it comes to that kind of very intellectual language that very carefully places them as not relevant to the entire conversation. So he unpacks that through his language, and he calls into question everything that has been represented for us. And so we see it as a deeply political text, because where is the voice coming from? That's the primary question. What is being said? What is being spoken? Can we understand them? Are we taking the effort to understand it in the first place? Right? Because the idea of Almighty Voice itself, the name, is interpreted as the voice of the Great Spirit. That means he's literally the voice of the people. But are you listening to them? You know, because it's not the question of them not speaking. So It's not a question of them not communicating. It's a question of, are you paying attention to what they are saying? The voice is coming, but we're like, oh, who's speaking? Do we really care about who is actually communicating? So this wraps up our pretty intense discussion on Rudy Wiebe's Where is the Voice Coming From? Thank you.